I am going to start a little bit with some scene setting, what is ESG, and just talk a little bit about the legal landscape too, and if there is a theme or a message that I hope comes out of the presentation today, it is the fact that ESG is increasingly moving out of the domain of like governmental affairs, sort of CSR, PR, which is where it has sat for a number of years, more into the kind of legal and compliance role, and we're really seeing a lot of hard law developing in this area. But I'm really actually very pleased to see that most people don't work on this on a daily basis, because it makes my first slide actually helpful as opposed to condescending, I hope. So what is ESG? I think the E is perhaps the most obvious of the three. It's the environmental. And obviously business has been concerned with environmental matters now for decades. I think given the sort of urgency of the climate crisis, there's been an enormous focus on climate within the E, but biodiversity is becoming sort of increasingly prevalent and important there as well, the circular economy, deforestation, and of course you have just your sort of traditional environmental compliance and regulatory matters that fit within that as well. The S, I think, is a little bit more confusing. It stands for social, but really what does that mean? And I think when you're talking about businesses, a starting point is kind of employees and labour rights and working conditions, and increasingly we're talking about things like DEI. It's also human rights, and human rights both within the company's own operations, but what we're increasingly seeing is a focus on the impact that a business has on the human rights of people throughout its value chain and throughout its sort of global operations. And then there's the G, and for me, so G is for governance, and for me this is a little bit like, how do we get the first two bits done? What policies and processes and other things do companies need to be putting into place to achieve the goals that they set within the first two buckets? But it's also matters like anti-corruption, AML, tax issues, tax avoidance, tax evasion, so that sort of fits in there as well. So this is sort of going back to the point that I made at the outset, which is this sort of hardening in the ESG world from sort of the beginnings of kind of soft law instruments, a lot of them at the kind of international level. The United Nations has been very busy in terms of promoting treaties and other sort of international instruments in these areas. But we're really moving, as you look towards the right of the slide, to a hardening into actual legislation and regulation. So some of the kind of key points here, the UK was actually really a first mover here with the Modern Slavery Act, which has now been in place for almost a decade. But the sort of regulation that you see towards the right of the slide, the French Loi de Vigilance, the German Supply Chain Act, is really starting to get to a point of requiring companies to conduct due diligence and then report out on the impacts that they have on a global basis on things like the environment and human rights. The US is getting involved as well, although it's a few steps behind the EU and the UK. And the EU, the regulation there is just really taking off. There's a new reporting directive, but there is also going to be a due diligence directive that we anticipate will come into force in the next couple of years, which again is all about looking throughout a value chain, reporting on human rights impacts, having a climate transition plan to get to net zero. And it will, while it's an EU directive, the EU is very keen for it to have extraterritorial effect, i.e. an effect on companies outside of the European Union. So if you're hitting a sort of certain presence threshold in the EU, you'll be expected to comply with that as well. So before I get a little bit more into risk, which is what I talk about a lot because I'm a lawyer, I wanted to talk a little bit about ESG-related opportunities, because it really isn't all bad news. The just transition, the transition to like net zero is creating an enormous amount of opportunity and value, and I think particularly in the construction and project industries. And you sort of see these numbers on the left-hand side of the slide. Like, we're looking at investment levels of $4 trillion trillion US dollars by 2030, and that is a combination of public money and private capital. Greenium, we've got sort of lower capital costs and other financial benefits associated with investments in sort of positive ESG areas. The US famously signed the Inflation Reduction Act into law last year. We're talking there about $370 billion in investment that they're hoping to attract through tax incentives and subsidies and other things. And the US really isn't the only country to have done that. The EU's Green Industrial Plan likewise creates a lot of kind of value opportunity here too. But there is also risk, and this is what I'll sort of focus on for the rest of the presentation. And I would categorize these risks into legal risks into three buckets. So we've talked a lot about this already. There is an increasing amount of regulation. It is for the time being very much focused on public companies and in particular large public companies. But because of this emphasis on companies being required to report out through their whole value chain, that's having an impact then on smaller companies that feed into these larger companies' operations, because they are going to need to start providing the information that the large public companies need to be able to report out. So the UK, we now have public company reporting under the TCFD, is the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. It's an international task force that is kind of trying to really set the standard here. And you have sort of FCA regulators, you have the stock exchanges as well, increasingly issuing ESG-related guidelines and requirements. The EU we've talked a little bit about already, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, placing a lot of non-financial reporting requirements onto larger companies there, and the CSDDD, which will get into the due diligence obligations in a couple of years. Enforcement, and this is enforcement even when there isn't necessarily an explicit regulation requiring companies to do a specific thing in relation to ESG, and this has been largely focused on misleading advertising and sustainability claims. So as we've seen the sort of value around ESG increase and investors looking to invest in positive ESG projects, we're seeing a lot of companies really promoting their own ESG credentials, sometimes without the substance to back it up. So one of the most famous of these was Deutsche Bank's investment arm, and Deutsche was actually raided in May 2022. There was a whistleblower basically sat in their sustainability team who went to the regulator and said, look, we're saying that we consider ESG in all of our investments. We actually don't. And they were raided. There's an enforcement action in Germany and in the US, and they're actually also being sued in Germany as well. In the UK, we famously had investigations into ASOS, Boohoo, and Asda over claims about environmental sustainability that, again, saying that those really weren't backed up, and the same trend in the US as well. And then finally, there is a lot of litigation around these issues too, and it's really being driven by two market forces. Civil society actors, so NGOs, who are trying to use litigation to push change. They don't think that the governments are working quickly enough to introduce regulation, so they're trying to push it with litigation. There's also a big market here too, claimant-side law firms who are sort of going out into the world and trying to find situations where they can bring class actions against large corporate actors on climate claims or human rights related claims. And again, I sort of divided this into three big trends that we're seeing at the moment. There are actual claims being brought against corporates for climate change related damage and impacts. There was a very famous case against Shell in the Netherlands, the result of which was a declaratory order from the courts there that Shell has to reduce their scope 1, 2 and 3 climate emissions by 2030. It was an enormous moment in litigation generally, to be honest. Greenwashing claims, it goes back a little bit to the enforcement actions that I was just talking about. So those are claims for misleading public statements and disclosures. And then a trend that we're seeing in the UK at the moment is efforts to hold parent companies who are headquartered here for the activities of their subsidiaries abroad, negative environmental and human rights impacts. So how do we address this? It's not all bad news. This slide really sort of tries to capture the advice that we are giving to our clients. And it is all, again, it's all about the G. It's risk management systems. It is making sure that your policies and procedures are there, that you have ESG related policies and procedures, and that they align with what you're publicly saying that you're doing about ESG. Integrating these processes and policies with existing policies and process for anti-corruption and other risks that already exist. Companies know how to do this. So what we tell people is really like use what you've already got and just try to integrate these new risks into those systems. And then, this is sort of, I guess, a bit of a sell really, but introducing lawyers as this becomes more of a legal, hard regulated area, bring us in. We can also help to kind of protect documents and process development and investigations from disclosure. And I'll just leave with some sort of practical tips, and I'll leave these up on the slide. I'm happy to talk about these a bit more later, but I'm at time.
So Sam and Alex have done a really brilliant job of setting the scene in terms of the macroeconomic and organisational landscape of ESG. But as Chloe mentioned, I want to talk about the practical boots on the ground, what this actually means at a site level. Because of my background, I'm going to be focusing particularly on the environmental side, so we'll dive into some examples of what that looks like at the site level. And then we need to talk a little bit about carbon in construction, because that's become so synonymous with the E in ESG. So environmental policy implementation in a construction company or really in any organisation has traditionally been managed by an environmental management system, so an EMS. Most companies have this. We have had our third-party verified ISO 14001 certification since 2005, and this is what really shapes what we do and how we do it at a site level. So sounds like a boring load of numbers and a load of procedures to back it up. It kind of is. It's a bit clunky, but it means we do what we plan to do, and we've been strategic about how we do it. So we've looked into our risks and opportunities on the environmental side, and then we've worked through the best way to minimise the risks and maximise on the opportunities that are available. And we think that puts us in a really good place when we're tendering for projects. So having an ISO 14001 certification actually tends to be a minimum level for the clients that we work with. At PQQ stage, we'll be asked, do you have this? And if you don't, then you don't tend to even get to the tendering stage. So I wanted to work through a practical example, because there are so many different things that you could do to kind of illustrate this. And I've chosen waste management as an example of how ESG plays out at a really basic boots on the ground site level. So we've got the negative potential impacts, the things we want to avoid, highlighted here in black, and then the things that we really want to promote and the benefits that we can see as an organisation shown in yellow. And this is just in relation to waste management at site level. So from the environmental perspective, it's pretty obvious. The more we minimise waste on site, the better it's going to be for the environment. But the great thing here is there's actually a commercial benefit for doing so. So the cost of waste for a main contractor like ourselves is normally within our prelims. So if we minimise waste, then we actually benefit that increases our profit. Really clued up contractors can also maximise that by understanding things like on-site segregation. So the more we segregate waste on site and then send clean loads off to our waste contractors, the cheaper it is to send that waste away. Because actually when that waste gets to a waste transfer station, it has to go through minimal sorting. They can just send that on to the next processor of that material, rather than getting a mixed load of materials that people have physically got to sort. It's got to go through big machinery, which of course all costs money. So doing things smart on the environmental side with regards to waste management actually pays off. On the social side, it's a bit of a challenging situation with regards to the waste management industry. Unfortunately, it is an industry that is somewhat predisposed to criminal activity, particularly modern slavery, which has been mentioned already. A lot of the workers in the waste industry are temporary workers. They often originate from outside of the UK, and those are all factors that potentially increase the likelihood that you will find modern slavery in the supply chain. Something which would obviously be disastrous if you were to be connected with that as an organisation, paying that company to remove your waste. It's not all bad though on the social side. So actually the waste contractors that we engage with tend to be some of the most socially responsible and engaged out of anyone in our supply chain. And I don't know whether that's because they are managing waste, which is obviously clearly a negative environmental impact, that they then want to make such an effort with regards to the social side. But they genuinely care and see the benefit in getting engaged with the circular economy, community engagement activities, and they're exactly the kind of organisations that then Morgan Lovell want to work with. So they reap the reward of positioning themselves in that way. From a governance perspective, again, the waste industry has not got a great reputation. So from illegal waste dumps in the UK, links with the mafia in the US, there's potentially a lot that could go wrong and some huge fines involved if you do, in fact, get it wrong. And the only way to cover yourself with regards to this is to have a really clear and robust auditing system for the waste contractors that you engage with. And it's all very well having that policy, but it needs to be implemented as well. And the only way that that does get implemented is if we have management buy-in and really clear governance to ensure that our site teams feel empowered to not only know the rules and know the people they should be engaging with, but actually feel confident in being able to engage with them regardless of cost. So they might not be the cheapest waste contractor, but they're the people that will minimise our risk as an organisation. And our site teams feel empowered to do that because there's buy-in from the top. So in summary, managing ESG effectively at site level has a real tangible impact on a company's profits and how attractive it is to its shareholders and to clients. And this is just one example of how this plays out in practice. There are loads of others. So carbon in construction. As I said, carbon's become somewhat synonymous with the E in ESG, and it's the E that I really care about, being an environmental professionalist and environmentalist. And the reason why it's spoken about so often in construction is because 25% of our carbon emissions as the UK come directly from the built environment. So us as an industry, we have a huge part to play in impacting on the climate emergency that we're currently facing. So I wanted to share with you something quite specific on carbon that will hopefully appeal to those who actually work at site level as part of projects. And this is the relationship between carbon optioneering, so when we are involved in a project, how we minimise carbon, and how that relates to the accuracy of carbon modelling, which is going to become more and more widely seen as time goes on, and cost, which is of course always going to be important. So we've got the REBA stages, a REBA plan of work stages along the bottom here, showing time marching on towards the initial stage to project completion. And as you can see, the carbon reduction potential of options associated with a building project is much, much higher at the beginning. There are more options available and they are more impactful. That drops off really quickly as the design gets more detailed. You get closer to construction and then obviously get closer to completion. As soon as you're on site actually building it, there's a really limited amount that you can do to really affect change. The negative part of that, though, is that accuracy of modelling at the initial stages is really low. So you don't have the data, unfortunately, at the initial stages to really prove it in the way you want to, the impact that that's going to have. But we can't wait until the accuracy of the carbon modelling is really precise, because at that point, your carbon reduction potential has really dropped off. Cost is key as well, and unfortunately, again, the cost of making really meaningful, impactful decisions in terms of carbon reduction on a construction project increases as time goes on. So the number of options is more limited, and then they become more expensive to make a more meaningful difference. And I think this is quite a useful analogy to the practical application of ESG policy in general. We can't wait until we have really, really detailed data to act. And we know that the cost is going to go up of making meaningful change the longer we delay in actually doing something.
I'm going to stay sitting, otherwise I dance all over the front, and that's distracting for everyone, including myself. So thank you for having me. Thank you to the audience for showing up today. This is the first time I've ever been asked to speak about DEI within the context of ESG, so I welcome the challenge. It's a good conversation to have because we tend to look at DEI in a silo sometimes. We're focused on all things that, within that space, but it does thread through everything. I would argue every strand of ESG touches DEI. And so I guess in some ways my presentation is kind of a championing and arguing for DEI to have more of a presence within the DEI or within the ESG space beyond just the social. There are some governance aspects, especially and emerging for sure, and I'll talk about that toward the end. But first, I wanted to just break down what diversity, equity, and inclusion is. This is not meant to be an insult on anyone's intelligence. I know a lot of people are very familiar with these concepts and these terms, but I just wanted to break it down anyway, just in case. And so diversity is about data. It's the demographic makeup of an organization, of a community, but that's it. It's the data. It's what people look like, where they come from, their backgrounds by numbers within an organization. And so trying to achieve diversity within your organization alone isn't going to cut it. It's not going to get us anywhere because it's literally just changing the makeup of your organization. It's a step. It's a great step in the right direction, and collecting that data is a huge piece of this, which I will talk loads about throughout this presentation, but it's purely the data piece of it. Equity is where we take that next step and we go, right, here's the makeup of our organization. How are we ensuring that every individual has the right kind of resources and support to be able to thrive and succeed in our organization or our community, you name it. And so we've seen historically the use of the word equality, and equity is a deliberate choice here because it's about deliberate action. Equality is about giving everyone the same access regardless of who you are, where you come from, what your accessibility needs are. Everyone's treated the same. And if we continue on with that kind of a thought process, the McKinsey Institute tells us it's going to take us 150 years to achieve gender balance in the professional environment. And gender is where, binary gender is where we've made the most progress as society. So you can imagine what that means for the rest of our demographic groups that we're looking at within the DEI space. 150 years. So that means it requires us to take deliberate action, and that's why we're saying equity. The most simple way of describing it is, equality is about giving everyone in this room the same exact pair of shoes, regardless of size, regardless of the work that you do. Everyone gets the same set of shoes. Equity is about looking at you as individuals and making sure you get the shoes that fit and they're fit for purpose for the work that you do, and your needs as an individual. And so that's equity. Finally, inclusion is that great space we want to be in. An inclusive environment is where we've taken the steps to diversify our organization. We've put equitable practices into place to make sure everyone's getting the resources and support they need. Inclusion is about making sure every individual feels like they actually belong within the organization. They're valued and they're heard. They have a seat at the table. And so all of this has to happen together in order for an organization to be sustainable. If you're not doing all of these things, your organization is not sustainable, and it will not last compared to competitors who are prioritizing this work. So then we look at why it matters. I already hit on that top point, so I guess I could have changed the slide first, but people are prioritizing, people want to invest in organizations and want to work for organizations who are investing in inclusion. If you're not taking the time to prioritize this, like I said, your organization isn't sustainable, and you're going to fall behind. Also, if you're not diversifying your organization, building those inclusive environments, it's not possible for you to deliver the goods and services that you need for society, for your clients, et cetera, because you're not bringing that diversity of thought into the planning and delivery of your projects. So what DEI entails. It is a bugbear for me that a lot of people think DEI is just HR functions. It's all about recruitment and retention and development. That's DEI, end of story. Okay, moving on. Actually, it's everything. Like I said at the beginning, it's about our policies and practices. Absolutely. It is about that representation piece, which we get through recruitment and retention practices. But it's also about general accessibility considerations. If we are not in this space, in the built environment and the construction environment, if we are not building spaces that put inclusion at the forefront of those projects and how we're designing and thinking through them, are these spaces accessible to everyone within the community that we're serving? Is it inclusive of everyone who wants to come and we want to come and use this space? If you're not thinking through that at the very beginning stage, Jean Hewitt, she's an advisor to government and has worked on a lot of great guidance materials and standards. She says, if we're not doing that, then we're setting our projects up for premature obsolescence. So before we've even delivered them, we're setting them up for obsolescence because we haven't thought through, does this space work for everyone? And then it goes back to it, again, that space is not sustainable. And so it's about that, it's about data and insights, it's about measurable benchmarks and objectives. I read a report that irked me on ESG because, like I said, I've not briefed in this space before, so I've done a lot of nerding out and Googling and reading different reports, and I read a recent report that talked about social within ESG and how it framed DEI, was a little bit dismissive and was like, DEI is very qualitative and not quantitative, and therefore we've not done a whole lot for that in this report. We're categorizing it as a human rights issue, end of story. And that made my eye twitch, temperature rise. Everything about DEI is actually quantifiable. It's measurable, everything, literally. Some of it is you feel like the softer side on culture, but even the culture of your organization is measurable. Employee engagement surveys. There are organizations that are brilliant that have developed surveys to assess specifically the culture within your organization. So everything literally is measurable, and it's not an excuse. I'll get off my soapbox in a minute. But it is about finding those measurable, those items and seeing how you're progressing your organization forward. It's about engagement, communications, it's about customer experience, it's about procurement. It touches literally everything. But the bottom line is it's about your organizational culture. And whether people want to work for you, whether people want to work with you. So on the horizon, I'll start with what we're doing in the RICS space first. As a professional body, we have an obligation to lead in this space, to think through what's coming around the corner, how we can best serve our member firms and our members and society. We have a very big public interest piece with our organization. So one of the big things we're getting after is that data collection piece. So we've improved how we're collecting demographic data, not just from our employees, from our members, but we're also working with other professional bodies and the Supply Chain Sustainability School to look at how we do industry-wide data collection and benchmarking. So as organizations, your only comparator isn't ONS, like we're working with right now. There's a built environment benchmarking document where you can see where you fit within, your organization fits within the work that's going on in this space. So a lot of positive progress on the data side for us, but we're also looking at our rules of conduct for our members and our member firms, because that's a huge part of why we exist as a regulator. And so last year we added diversity, inclusion, and respect to our rules of conduct, and now we're doing the work to really build that out with case studies and more robust guidance and expectations, so that moving forward we can start to bring, that's on the carrot side, we're educating, but we'd love to get to that space where we start regulating if organizations are not taking this seriously, because we all should be. And lastly, on the bigger picture, some of the things we're hit on already here, and I mentioned at the beginning on the governance side, I would fully expect, I think the UK government is prepping the stage, if anyone is aware. They've put out guidance recently on ethnicity pay gap reporting. We're all very accustomed to gender pay gap reporting, and now they're priming the field for ethnicity pay gap reporting. They've issued the guidance. They're telling everyone how to do the data collection, what methodology you can use to build these reports, and I guarantee around the corner is expectation to make that public. And so if organizations are not taking this seriously and paying attention, you're going to fall behind. And the same could be said about demographic makeup of boards at senior level positions. In Europe, we're seeing some government pushes for mandatory quotas, 40% women on boards, those types of things. I'm sure we'll see that echoing around other places, and then it'll work its way into ESG reporting. So all of these things are there, and they're creeping in. I think we're up against some of the same things in the DEI space that ESG is. There's no global standard. It's an emerging field, even though it's been around since the beginning of human existence, really. As a field of focus, there is no standardizing organization that has the end-all, be-all rules for what right looks like. But I see even that progressing and moving, and more collaborations happening in that space. So I think it's a really exciting time to be paying a lot more attention to DEI and having those conversations about how we as a built environment industry can work together better, drop the competitive barriers and look at, right, how do we all get after this together? Because if we don't, then we all lose. So yeah, I think that's all I had in mind.
So please remind me to keep this up to my face, because otherwise, with my hands go flying, you may not hear me. Apologies. So just picking up on what Sam said, I'm a practitioner, so this conversation is really going to be about how do you do ESG reporting in practice, what are some of the challenges, things to consider, and hopefully give some advice to everybody so that if you're interested in getting involved or maybe helping some of your teams in your companies, you know how best to do that. So I would like to begin by just doing a review of the ESG reporting landscape, and I kind of bucket this in 4 groups, starting with the UK. And I know Sam kind of picked up on a little bit of this, so I'll just kind of do a high-level review. But what we have here is a real focus on the mandatory regulatory requirements that usually come in an annual report or in complementary reports that will come afterwards. So it's focused on a high-level enterprise disclosures, tends to be investor-focused in the audience, and from some of the topics you might recognize, they tend to focus on climate and social elements, specifically diversity. Unfortunately, there is some repetition. So like Sam had mentioned, TCFD, BEIS is also coming out with something incredibly similar that also overlaps with SECR. So something to think about as a practitioner, how do you balance all of these things that are slightly different but have a lot of overlap, unfortunately. On the second layer that's kind of encompassing all this is our global standards and frameworks. These in nature are voluntary for now. Like Sam mentioned, those are going to be changing in the future, but still at the discretion of an organization. They are more topic specific, but as a whole, you can see that they cover a wider range of topics that are currently required. So for example, ISSB is a newly formed organization that's going to be trying to develop a global standard for reporting so that ESG disclosures in Canada, Germany, Australia, Japan will be talking to each other or similar for investors, which is really important. GRI has its own standards and metrics that companies can report on, but the audience is wider. They have a more inclusive stakeholder engagement. So again, slightly different metrics and information that would have to be disclosed through that. Science-based targets, SBTI, solely focused on metrics and targets and defining what does Paris-aligned mean to kind of avoid the greenwashing that happens. CDP, 3 different questionnaires, lots of overlap, 3 different topics, climate, water, forest, not to be confused with TNFD, which is going to be the sister of TCFD, but that's fully focused on biodiversity. And then kind of we have the UN Sustainable Development Goals, Global Compact Principles, that's really focused on what it means to be a responsible business and tends to be really favored amongst organizations that have operations or impacts in the global south. So again, another type of audience, another focus and demand. And then finally, I also would look to Europe. Morgan Stanley personally is not required to comply because of our jurisdiction with any EU policies, but as Sam again alluded to, what's happening in Europe is what's coming down the pipeline. It's going to influence the new regulation in the UK. It sets back practice. US is a bit behind, but I'm still looking into that. And it goes to show for any organization that what is expected or required is going to be very different from what is best practice. So you might be indirectly influenced, and as your other peers or competitors are moving into that space, you might be thrown into that. So again, just looking at what's coming down the pipeline. And then finally, the fourth element is our ESG rating agencies. I just chose a few of the bigger ones, but they have their own methodologies. They choose their own indicators. They choose their own topics, and they also choose different weightings of how they prioritize those. So that leads us to what I call the wild, wild west of ESG. And this is, if this is just a wow, that's the sole purpose. Please do not look into the nitty gritty of this slide. It's just to show you how all of these different organizations that have emerged are talking to each other, sharing information. I think the key highlights is to show that we have credit agencies that are getting involved now to show what is good, what is resilient. You have indices, so for your passive investments, just to be included as a company or as a sector is really important to think about. And then finally, also proxy voters. How are they going to, vote at your AGMs, or what are your investors going to be demanding? So big players that are influencing this. It just goes to show that any information that you put out in an annual report, a sustainability report, things of that nature, will have a ripple effect. It will be taken, changed, transcribed in different ways. So you have to just maintain that awareness that things can change. Unfortunately, also, I guess perhaps it's actually fortunate, but AI is also moving into the space that will only complicate this further, because now you can pick up blogs, news articles, things of the nature, so stuff that you don't directly put out in a public space, but others do, and that can also shape your ESG reputation. Unfortunately, as a practitioner, if you're trying to target something, it tends to be you're running in different directions because there's very poor correlation amongst maybe targeting one agency or organization and overlap with the others. You would expect this type of correlation with your credit scores or other things in your daily life. So it just shows that ESG is still emerging. There's a long way to go, unfortunately, but the momentum is there and you got to pick up. So what is a practitioner like me supposed to do, or people who want to get involved in this? What are some advice that I can give? First thing, chase what matters. A good materiality assessment for any organization is vital. Do it robustly, do it frequently. We only choose certain questionnaires that we've identified that are important for our investors, and that's what we're going to be monitoring because there's purpose, there's value behind that, given limited resources and time. Being proactive, we are I'm already planning and working on things that won't come into effect until 2025. You don't wait until it's mandatory for your next reporting cycle. You start building those capabilities and that having those internal discussions now. Treat ESG data like financial data. It needs to have the governance. It needs to have that robustness. You can't be setting commitments and targets and things like that nature unless you have a solid base. So there has to be that sort of robust treatment of ESG data, just the way you would do for a financial statement. Also pursuing ESG synergies. I know that the previous slides we talked about a lot of topics in silos, but at the end of the day, they will have another ripple effect. So for example, climate change, you might be focusing on carbon emissions, but indirectly you're going to be talking about waste management, you're going to be talking about biodiversity, other things. So it's really great when you think of organizations that will try to achieve one thing and then you realize that it can have a momentous effect on other elements, again, given limited times and resources. So that's really important. It's a marathon, not a sprint. Sometimes in previous roles, I feel more like a cheerleader saying, well done, on a runner that's on mile 17 of a marathon, and to keep on going, especially since as the space is changing so much, we might be adding more milestones and more length to that run. So it's also important that from a reporting standpoint, you do report on those little milestones, those little steps along the way. Don't wait until you have a big ta-da moment, but talk about the challenges, talk about how you're getting there. That's also really important. And then finally, building capacity and relationships. I've seen a lot of organizations hire people with an ESG expertise, and that's really great, or do trainings and developments to enhance current, understanding of the topic. But it's really an interdisciplinary subject, so you need to bring people with different backgrounds, and I think Morgan Sindel does a fantastic job of that, bringing them to the table. Everybody has something to contribute with, and again, saying, to those naysayers or other people that might have challenges, that's the only way that you're going to advance this and breaking down some of those barriers. So with that, I think so we'll just end it there then.